You know, folks, some things just complement each other perfectly. I mean, a good example, of course, is pizza and beer. Maybe if you're a little bit more sophisticated, you're into the whole cheese and wine kind of thing. Also, one thing that you can't escape is patch vests and weird smells. Those usually go together pretty well. But what about albums? What about records? My buddy over at the Dark Path, Matt, came up with a contest talking about records that compare to each other, complement each other, occupy the same space in your mind. So I thought I'd enter. So join me. We'll get into it in just a moment. Wait for the Tom Hanks scream. Before we start checking out these pairs, I should mention what we're listening to. It's the self-titled debut by Nemeris, British atmospheric black metal. Just came out a little while ago, a couple weeks ago, on Bindrune. Check it out. Bindrune's got a bunch of great new stuff that just came out, including the new Panopticon. So, Matt, congratulations on 1,000 subs. Well-deserved. Well-earned. Great topic. Earlier on in Matt's YouTubing career, he was throwing out really cool thread topics left and right. It's nice to see him return to that because they're always fun to reply to. This one specifically, as I mentioned in the intro, is pairings, albums that complement each other. And I thought of, immediately had a flood of nostalgia of records that I listened to when I was a kid. And that's mostly what this stuff is. And they complement each other on several different ways, which I'll get into as I progress through. Yeah, a lot of pairs. I didn't do just one. I have over like 5 in this, I believe. To start, we've got a couple of thrashers from the early 90s. You know, going outside of the box of thrash, thrash was in its death knell at the time, and it was 90, 91-ish when Forced Entries, As Above, So Below, and Wrathchild America's 3D came out. They both have a weird kind of approach to stuff, very adept musicianship with both units here. As Above, So Below is like pretty aggressive, not veering into brutal thrash so much, but kind of reminding me a bit of like a way more technical Crumbsuckers, got kind of a crossover-y vibe, kind of jarring, you know, almost kind of weirdly angular approach to like riffs here and there. Great heavy stuff. There's a couple goofy thrash tunes on there, as was the custom in the 80s and early 90s in this case. You know, thrash metal was really in its death throes when these came out. Death metal was, of course, blowing up, and there was other stuff going on like grunge, and these bands were still pretty well regarded at the time, and I think it's because they were doing something a little bit more imaginative than, you know, the thrash bands from just a few years before. And then we have Wrathchild America's 3D. This gets weird, almost proggy at a certain point. There's a cool Hellraiser referencing song. What's that called? What's Your Pleasure? There's a cool instrumental called Prego that covers all these different genres of music. Yeah, it's all over the place, like in a pretty entertaining way. The vocalist has a real, like, almost kind of cleaner Hetfield sort of yell shout sort of thing going on, which I like a lot. Great stuff. I listen to these two endlessly. Skateboarding, the summer that was between 7th and 8th grade. So those will always stick together in my mind. Along that time, that same summer, I picked up the Dead Embryonic Cells cassette single by Sepultura. Just 3 songs on this. The title track, cover of Orgasmatron, and a redo of Troops of Doom. And it was because of the cover of Orgasmatron that I bought the album Orgasmatron by Motörhead. Now, I was well versed with Motörhead already. I bought 1916 a year or two before when it came out. I was a massive fan of that. I picked up the No Remorse compilation, Iron Fist, I think maybe one other album. I hadn't heard this yet, but I read in interviews that it was one of Max Cavalera's favorite Motörhead records, this and Rock and Roll, which is the one that came after, and I had to get it. You know, weird production. Bill Laswell, who was a I believe like a dance and industrial producer guy produced it. The bass sound is very odd on it. It's got almost a strangely like sort of cold vibe to it. But some of my favorite Motörhead songs to this day, namely Mean Machine's a great one. Ridin' with a Driver is such a deep cut. Nobody ever talks about how great that song is. It rules. And of course Orgasmatron, which if you take away the growly vocals is like almost musically identical to the Sepultura cover. I think that's what was so impressive to me about it, was that this came out in '86, and it's a very, very, that song in particular being about, you know, warmongering, is a very, very dark, very, very heavy song, ahead of its time in my opinion. This came out on Profile, GWR, back in '86. After that, I've got a couple of blasters, a hardcore and a grindcore record that go well together. I think of these in the same headspace because I had both on CD back in the day. We're talking about Ringworm's The Promise and World Downfall by Terrorizer. I had both on CD back in the day, and I dubbed them onto a tape so I could listen to it on a Walkman. And, I mean, we're talking about bands from other planets, essentially, at least in regards to the 90s, when things were a lot more segregated in terms of scenes and subcultures and what have you. This odd band from Cleveland that mixed influences from New York hardcore, some 80s American hardcore punk, a bunch of Slayer, and blast beats. Where they were getting the blast beats from, I'm not totally sure. I did read an interview with the Human Furnace where he talked about how their old bassist was really into all that Slap-a-Ham stuff and some early grind. So that's where that comes in, I think. But there's a lot of that great, like, one-footed blast style stuff on this. It's kind of sloppy, but it sounds awesome. And then you've got Human Furnace, who at the time sounded like a more evil hybrid of John Joseph from the Cro-Mags and Ray of Today from Youth of Today. So it's got this distinct, like, dark NYHC edge. And of course this would go on to influence tons of stuff, including Hatebreed and much bigger bands. But this is a very, like, stripped-down, scrappy-sounding recording with a seriously dark aura to it and some really evil lyrics as well. And then you have Terrorizer, who also have a similar blasting style but way tighter, that just have these stripped-down grindcore songs. If you're a fan of anything remotely close to death metal or grindcore, I'm sure you're familiar with this release. It's one of the best of its kind. But just back-to-back, playing these back and forth with each other was just awesome. They fit together like peanut butter and jelly. So good. And in high school, early on in high school, I was getting into, outside of death metal, which was blowing up at the time, I was discovering old punk and stuff like that. And I believe this is the first Misfits that I picked up, pretty sure. So, I mean, this is the most abrasive Misfits record there is. It came out posthumously. It's a caterwauling blitzkrieg of feedback and super fast riffing, super fast drums. You know, it's almost like Misfits' little entry into, like, we're trying to keep up with the Joneses and play faster hardcore, you know, being around since, like, 77 or 78 and having, like, kind of poppier songs early on. They were hanging out with the Necros and Negative Approach and bands like that, so that's their entry into that. I bought this the same time I bought Danzig 2, and I was very confused. Information was not as readily available then as it is now with the internet and everything, but I did know via Thrasher and a few other sources that it was the same guy singing for the Misfits that sang for Danzig, Glenn Danzig, of course. And it was weird. I did not like Danzig 2 at all the first time I heard it. I thought it sounded like country music, bluesy, acoustic, rock-driven metal stuff, but I kept going back to it. Long Way Back from Hell is just such a rager. It just kept me intrigued. And it was weird to go, oh, but then there's this guy yelling, what are the lyrics on this? Demonomania, my mother was a wolf. My father was a wolf. My mother was a whore. All the crazy shit on here, and then going to this. Fun stuff. Then this sprang to mind after I made all my picks, but I added it last second. Bands that influenced each other a lot, or namely one band influencing another, is Celtic Frost, Morbid Tales, and the debut Sheer Terror record, Just Can't Hate Enough. Of course, you know, chances are if you're watching this channel, you know Celtic Frost, legendary band, pioneers in extreme metal all around, very distinct guitar sound, very distinct riff style. And then you have Sheer Terror, which, if you pay attention to hardcore, you'd probably know who they are as well. You know, another pioneer of darker metallic hardcore, along with Ringworm, I'd say, in terms of influencing a lot of bands from the generation after. This is an insane fusion of very distinct Celtic Frost influence, guitar sound and riff approach with just mean as fuck hardcore. Namely, a lot of the, I'd say, Negative Approach, maybe some of the Boston stuff, the harder edged New York stuff at the time, and just these great, like, growled, grunted kind of vocals from Paul Bearer. He does belt it out occasionally as well, sings really mournfully and uniquely too. There's not too many people that were doing what he was doing. It was a bit of a croon, but had good range, and he did it sparingly, and it was great. But there would be no Sheer Terror, at least as we know them, without the influence of Celtic Frost and Alan Blake, the guitarist from Sheer Terror at the time, taking that influence in. They almost immediately started to evolve out of the heavily influenced Celtic Frost stuff by their next record. But still, the influence is definitely there and very cool. Finally, after doing a little bit of reading, very briefly, I realized these actually came out the same year, which is wild to think. This is two bands from Louisville, Kentucky, King Horse and Endpoint. Both came out in 90. King Horse came out on Caroline. Looks like the Endpoint came out on Conversion Records, which was a hardcore label from the Midwest. I mentioned these two together. They're two bands from the same city, and they were friends. And maybe if you saw these records like next to each other on a record store wall, you would assume that they have nothing to do with each other if you didn't know anything about them. But the fact of the matter is that King Horse were kind of like very, very well regarded in their area during the time they were around, which was late 80s up until the early 90s. I think a lot of people were confused and maybe even let down after seeing the album cover. It's Pushead art. You know, the logo looks a certain way. I believe the ads in Thrasher said this is not a band, this is a holy war. And I think a lot of people were expecting some sort of like Slayerish thrash stuff, but instead what you got was this interesting blend of hard rock or early heavy metal that was super blistering and completely feral sounding, with, again, kind of crooned vocals that not a lot of people were really messing with at the time, that were kind of distinctly influenced by what seemed to be Southern rock. But it had the energy and the immediacy of hardcore. Really cool band, not for everybody, but I really, really liked them a lot. Also, one of my favorite lyrics, "You're not man enough to let me out of this cage." But the guy had a certain way of enunciating words. You could tell what part of the country he came from. And you can hear the influence on Rob Pennington's vocals and Endpoint's debut LP here, In a Time of Hate. In a Time of Hate is one of my favorite records of this style. You know, it's that fast, angry, sort of positive late 80s straight edge hardcore. I mean, early 90s, you know, technically, but they formed in the late 80s. At any rate, you know, super fuzzy sounding guitars, real crunchy. It sounds like they've been listening to a lot of Black Flag, which wasn't too common for a lot of those kind of youth crewish bands. Those weird kind of Greg Ginn sort of like harmonic little screechy noises, you know. Cool, and you can definitely tell that these guys were a fan of these guys, and they were also friends. The guys in King Horse were a little bit older, apparently, and I'd read a bunch of stories about how King Horse guys would sneak the Endpoint guys into shows and everything. But, again, if you saw the records side by side at a store and didn't know anything, you'd be like, oh, there's some long-haired dudes and straight-edge dudes, you know, probably have nothing to do with each other. This was also produced by Danzig, by the way. But yeah, if you want to hear some really interesting, like, kind of rock metal stuff by the way of hardcore, check it out. It's nothing quite like it. Kind of skips a lot of the verse, chorus, verse, like traditional songwriting things too. Very to the point and intense, but still like firmly rooted in early metal and hard rock. And this is just an all-around great fast hardcore record. Great lyrics, you know, pissed kind of music. There was a lot of like good straight edge fast hardcore from the Midwest at this point. I feel like it started to kind of disperse on the coasts, and you know, people started to play and different styles, a la Quicksand and everything, but Endpoint and Face Value and Confront kept going for a while, playing this very like furious to the point, great hardcore stuff. So both are recommended. Both have a big history with me. Endpoint was like one of the first hardcore bands I ever saw. King Horse, it took me a while to get into, to be honest. I always saw that ad in Thrasher, you know, when the internet started to get faster and I could download stuff. I downloaded it and was weirded out, and it wasn't what I expected. But now I love that record and I listen to it all the time. There is also a collection of all their demos and singles. I believe it's called Too Far Gone. That is also great. So those are my pairs. Those are all my pairings. There you go. That's it. Matt, congratulations again. If you happen to catch this tonight, you got another day. This is going till the end of 4th of July weekend. So I believe first thing on the 5th, your homework's due. So everybody join in and have fun. Peace.